Seren had mended a lot of broken things in her 23 years. Split seams, shredded banners, leather armor cracked down to the backing. She had once rebuilt a tapestry so badly burned that only the border threads remained, working stitch by stitch until the wolves in the weave looked whole again. But she had never walked into a room and found something she could not fix. Until tonight. She was not supposed to be in the East Corridor. The ceremonial hall was 3 floors below, and the banners she had finished restoring were already folded in her basket, ready for delivery in the morning. But Marin, the head mender, had left her shears in the upper workroom, and Marin's hands were too swollen with joint pain to climb the stairs herself. So Seren had gone up. The sound stopped her. A deep, grinding noise, like wood being split by hand, followed by something worse. A growl. Not the kind that came from a throat. The kind that came from a chest, from lungs too large for a human body, vibrating through the stone beneath her feet. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to turn around. She reached for the door instead. She pushed it open. The training hall was destroyed. Weapons racks lay splintered across the floor. Deep gouges ran across the walls in parallel lines, 4 marks at a time, carved into solid rock by something with claws that should not have existed on anything walking upright. And in the center of it all, Alpha King Kalen Vashar stood with his back to her. Except stood was the wrong word. He was hunched forward, his hands braced against the remains of a wooden rack, and his body was caught between shapes. His shoulders had expanded beyond the seams of his shirt. The fabric split across the back to reveal skin that rippled with something underneath. His fingers were too long, tipped with black claws that had buried themselves into the wood. And when he turned his head, the eyes that found her were not human. They were molten gold, blown wide, and utterly empty of recognition. The growl that rolled out of him shook her ribs. Seren did not scream. She did not run. She stood perfectly still in the doorway and felt every rational thought leave her body, replaced by a single, irrational certainty that she should not be afraid. He moved toward her, fast, crossing the distance in 2 strides that cracked the stone floor under his weight. His clawed hand seized her shoulder, pulling her forward until the gold eyes bore into hers from inches away, and she could see the war happening behind them. Something feral and something human, tearing at each other. "You are Kalen," Seren said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her more than anything else that had happened in the last 30 seconds. "You are the king, and you are hurting the floor, which someone is going to have to fix, and it will probably be me." Something flickered in the gold. His grip loosened. Not much, but enough. "Come back," she whispered. His pupils contracted. The gold bled away from the edges, gray seeping in like dawn pushing back the dark. His claws retracted slowly, and his fingers became fingers again, trembling against her arm. His grip loosened and the rest of him followed. He went down hard, his knees hitting the cracked stone, and then he was just a man on the floor, breathing like he had been drowning. Seren stood over him, her pulse roaring in her ears, and realized she had no idea what to do next. The doors behind her slammed open. Guards poured in, swords drawn, and behind them, moving with a calm that bordered on terrifying, came a tall man with close-cropped silver hair and the cold, assessing eyes of someone who had seen the worst of everything and learned to catalog it. "Stand away from the king," the first guard barked. "She stays," the silver-haired man said quietly, and every guard in the room stopped moving. He crossed to the king, knelt beside him, pressed 2 fingers to his throat, and counted silently. Then he looked up at Seren with an expression she could not read. "How long was he in the feral state before you intervened?" he asked. Seren shook her head. "I do not know. I just walked in. A minute, maybe less." The man's jaw tightened. "You brought him back in under a minute." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway. He stood and took her arm, guiding her toward the corridor with a grip that was firm enough to make refusal feel unwise. At the door, he paused. "My name is Theron. I am the king's beta, You will not speak of what you saw here tonight. Not to your fellow menders, not to the kitchen staff, not to the walls of your room when you think no one is listening. Is that understood? Yes, but is he going to be all right? Seren asked. Theron looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth. Something closer to calculation. Go to your quarters, he said. Do not leave the palace grounds. I will send for you in the morning. He released her arm and disappeared back through the doors, which closed behind him with a sound like a vault ceiling shut. Seren stood alone in the corridor, staring at the closed doors, her shoulders still aching where his grip had been. She made it back to her room in the lower quarters without remembering the walk. She sat on her narrow bed, pulled the blanket around her shoulders, and pressed her hands together to stop them from shaking. She did not sleep. When the knock came at dawn, she was still sitting exactly where she had been. A guard with a blank expression and a formal tone informed her that the beta required her presence immediately. Seren followed him up through the palace on legs that felt borrowed from someone else and wondered if she was walking toward an explanation or an execution. Theron's office was small and sparse. A desk, 2 chairs. A map of the territory pinned to the wall with more red marks on it than Seren thought was healthy. No decorations, no personal effects. He was seated behind the desk when she entered, and he did not waste time. The king suffers from what the healers call fracture episodes, Theron said. His wolf and his human mind lose alignment. When that happens, the wolf takes over. He becomes feral, violent, unable to distinguish between threat and ally. Seren lowered herself into the chair across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. How long has this been happening? Since the siege of Harrowfield. 14 months. 14 months of the most powerful man in the realm losing control of his own body. We have tried everything, Theron continued, his voice flat and clinical. Sedatives, binding chains, healers who specialize in wolf mind disorders. The best lasted 40 minutes before the king sent him running from the room. He paused. You lasted under 60 seconds and brought him back with a sentence. Seren opened her mouth, but nothing useful came out. The episodes are increasing in frequency, Theron said. 6 months ago, they occurred once a month. Now twice a week. Sometimes more. The healers believe that within 3 to 4 months, a fracture will become permanent. The wolf will take over entirely, and the man will not come back. The weight of that settled over her like cold water. What do you want from me? Seren asked. I want to confirm what I saw last night was not coincidence, Theron replied. He stood and moved toward the door. Follow me. He led her through corridors she had never seen, past guards who nodded at Theron without looking at her, and into a large room that might once have been a ballroom. It had been cleared of furniture. Thick iron rings were bolted into the far wall, and heavy chains lay coiled on the floor beneath them. Kaelin stood at the room's center. In the daylight, without the feral distortion, he was devastating in a completely different way. Tall enough that Seren had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Dark hair pushed back from a face that was all hard angles and shadow. His eyes were gray in the daylight, pale and sharp, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to back out of the room entirely. He did not look pleased to see her. This is the mender? He asked Theron, his voice low and rough. This is her, Theron confirmed. Kaelin's gaze swept over her once, dismissive and thorough, and Seren felt every inch of the gap between what she was and what he was. She was small. She was nobody. She mended things for a living, and she was standing in a repurposed ballroom with chains on the floor because the king of the realm could not control his own wolf. Sit there, Theron told her, pointing to a chair against the wall. Do not move unless I tell you to. Seren sat. Kaelin had turned away from her, his attention on Theron, and the two of them spoke in voices too low for her to hear. Minutes passed. She watched the king pace. Watched the tension coiled through his frame like a rope pulled to the point of snapping. Then it happened. A shudder ran through him. starting at his hands and traveling up his arms. His head snapped to one side, and the sound that came from his throat was the same deep, wet growl she had heard the night before. "Now," Theron said sharply. Seren was on her feet before she had consciously decided to stand. She crossed the room, and she could see the shift beginning, the skin rippling across his knuckles, the gold bleeding into his irises. She took his face in her hands. She did not know why. It was not something she had planned, but her palms pressed against his jaw, and she held his gaze, and she said, "Stay with me. You are here. You are Kaelin." The gold flickered, steadied, retreated. His breathing came in ragged bursts against her wrists, and she could feel the tremor running through him. The war beneath his skin winding down like a storm losing its center. His eyes cleared. Gray replaced gold. He stared at her, and for one raw, unguarded second, she saw something in his face that looked like relief so profound it bordered on pain. Then the walls came back up, and he stepped away from her hands. 43 seconds, Theron said from behind them, faster than last night. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Kaelin would not look at her. Seren's hands hung in the air where his face had been, and she lowered them slowly, unsure what to do with the strange ache in her palms. Theron cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, I believe we have our answer." "That was not a question," Kaelin said, his voice tight. "Nevertheless," Theron continued unfazed, "she needs to remain in close proximity. The Council has discussed options, and the most practical solution, the one that explains her constant presence without raising suspicion, is a formal arrangement." Seren frowned. "What kind of arrangement?" Theron reached into his jacket and produced a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside, resting on dark silk, sat a ring. A band of white gold set with a single pale sapphire that caught the light like trapped winter sky. "A betrothal," Theron said calmly. Seren stared at the ring, then at Theron, then at the king, who was staring at the far wall with the expression of a man who had swallowed something that disagreed with him. "You want me to pretend to be engaged to the king?" Seren said slowly. "Not pretend," Theron corrected. "The betrothal will be real. Legally binding. The court needs to believe it, the nobles need to believe it, and most importantly, you need to be at his side without question or obstruction." "I was not consulted about this," Kaelin said, his voice flat. "You were unconscious when the decision was made," Theron replied without apology. "And given that the alternative is permanent feral regression within 3 months, I took the liberty." The room fell silent. Seren looked at the ring, at the king, at the beta who was holding out the box like he was offering her a cup of tea. "I do not get a choice in this," Seren said. It was not a question. Theron's expression softened, just barely. "You do. But I would ask you to consider what happens to the realm if the king's mind is lost permanently." Seren looked at Kaelin. He still would not look at her. His body was rigid, and she realized with a start that he was ashamed, not of her, of needing her, of needing anyone. She reached out and took the ring from the box. It was heavier than she expected. She slid it onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, which felt like a cruel joke. "Fine," she said quietly, "but I want a better room. The one I have now has a draft that could strip paint." The hard line of his mouth loosened just slightly, and for half a second, he looked almost human. The announcement spread through the palace like wildfire. By the time Seren returned to the mending hall to collect her things, every pair of eyes she passed carried the same stunned, disbelieving expression. The king's betrothed, the mender, the girl who fixed curtains for a living. Marin was waiting at the workbench, her swollen hands folded over her apron, her face carefully neutral in a way that meant she was furious. "Sit down," Marin said. I cannot stay long. Theron wants me moved into the upper chambers by this evening, and I still need to pack my things, which should take about 4 minutes because I own almost nothing. And honestly, Marin, I do not think I have fully processed what is happening." "Sit. Down." Seren sat. Maren studied her face the way she studied damaged fabric, looking for the weak points. Is this by choice? Mostly, Seren said. Then quieter. He needs me. Plenty of people need things, Maren replied. That does not mean you owe them your life. The words landed somewhere in Seren's chest and stayed there, tender as a bruise. She did not have a response, so she fiddled with the ring on her finger instead, turning it back and forth. Maren's gaze dropped to the ring. Her expression changed. Something sharp and knowing entered her eyes, then disappeared so quickly Seren thought she had imagined it. Be careful, Maren said, and her voice was softer now. Kings take what they need and forget what it cost. The new chambers were obscenely large, a sitting room connected to a bedroom connected to a private bathing chamber with actual hot water. The bed was wide enough for 4 people, draped in deep blue linen that probably cost more than everything Seren had ever owned combined. Fresh flowers sat on the windowsill. A fire had been lit. None of it felt like hers. She set her basket of belongings on the floor, a spare dress, her mending kit, a carved wooden bird that Maren had given her on her 15th name day, and stood in the middle of the room feeling like an intruder. The adjoining door led to his chambers. She knew this because Theron had explained the layout with the same clinical detachment he applied to everything. The king's rooms are through that door. You will need to be within proximity during the night. The threshold should remain open. Within proximity. Like she was medicine with a dosage requirement. She ate supper alone in her room that first evening, sitting cross-legged on the enormous bed, chewing bread that was finer than anything she had tasted and feeling absolutely miserable about it. Through the adjoining door, she could hear Kaelin moving, the creak of a chair, the scratch of a pen, the occasional low murmur of him speaking to himself or possibly reading aloud. He did not come through the door. She did not go through it either. In the morning, Theron appeared at her chambers to escort her to breakfast in the great hall. She was seated beside the king at the high table, which meant the entire court spent the meal staring at her while she tried to eat porridge without doing anything embarrassing. Kaelin acknowledged her with a single nod and then proceeded to spend the entire meal in conversation with his advisors, as though the chair beside him was empty. Seren smiled when spoken to, answered polite questions about her background with the rehearsed responses Theron had coached her on the night before, and felt the ring on her finger like a brand. "Where are you from, my lady?" a noblewoman asked. "The lower quarters," Seren replied honestly, because she could not remember the approved answer. The silence that followed could have frozen the soup. After breakfast, Theron pulled her aside in the corridor. "The approved answer is the eastern provinces." "I forgot. Do not forget again." The days settled into a strange rhythm. Seren was fitted for new clothes she had not asked for. She attended meals beside a man who barely spoke to her. She sat in on council meetings where she understood perhaps a third of what was discussed, and she was introduced to an endless parade of nobles who all looked at her like they were trying to solve a puzzle that should not exist. And at night, she lay in her borrowed bed, the adjoining door cracked open, and listened to the king breathe until she fell asleep. The episodes still came. Twice that first week, she was pulled from whatever she was doing and rushed to his side. Each time, she took his face in her hands and spoke to him until the gold left his eyes. Each time, it was faster. Each time, when he came back, he looked at her with that same raw, exposed expression before the walls slammed shut again. On the 5th day, she found the portrait. She had taken a wrong turn in the East Wing, which was becoming a habit she should probably address, and ended up in a gallery she had never seen. The paintings were formal. Stiff portraits of Vashar kings and queens stretching back generations. She walked the line of them idly, studying the family resemblance, the same sharp jaw and gray eyes repeating across centuries. And then she stopped. The woman in the last portrait was beautiful. Dark auburn hair tumbling past bare shoulders, green eyes that held a warmth the painter had captured with almost painful precision, a smile that suggested a secret worth keeping. The gold plate beneath the frame read a single name, Davina. No title, no dates, No family name, just the name, as though everyone who mattered would already know who she was. You should not be in here. Seren spun. A servant stood in the doorway, her face tight with alarm. This gallery is not open to the household, the servant continued, already moving to usher Seren out. Lord Theron's orders. Who is she? Seren asked, looking back at the portrait as she was guided toward the door. The servant's mouth pressed into a thin line. No one you need concern yourself with, my lady. The door closed behind her, and Seren stood in the corridor with a name lodged in her mind like a splinter. That evening at supper, she sat beside Kaelin and watched him carve his meat with precise, mechanical movements. She gathered her nerve. Who is Davina? She asked. The knife stopped. His hand went still against the table, and the silence that fell between them was so sudden and so total that Seren could hear the candles burning. He did not look at her. When he spoke, his voice was stripped of everything. No one, he said. He did not say another word for the rest of the evening. The question sat between them like a wall for 3 days. Kaelin did not mention it. Seren did not ask again. But the silence had changed texture, growing heavier, charged with something she could not name. She threw herself into the only thing she knew how to do. She mended. Theron had arranged for the palace's overflow repairs to be sent to her chambers, tapestries and banners and dress uniforms that needed skilled hands. The episodes came less frequently now, 3 the second week, then 2 the third. Each time, Seren noticed something new. The way his breathing steadied fastest when she spoke, not when she touched him. The way his hands found her wrists after the gold receded, holding on for a beat longer than necessary before letting go. The way his gaze followed her when he thought she was not looking. Small things, deniable things. But she noticed. On a gray afternoon in the 3rd week, Seren was cross-legged on the floor of his study, restitching the torn hem of a ceremonial cloak, while Kaelin worked at his desk. They had fallen into this habit without discussing it. He worked. She mended. Neither of them acknowledged that she did not need to be in his study to do her repairs, or that he did not need her there to read reports. You hum when you sew, he said, without looking up. Seren's needle paused. I am sorry. Does it bother you? No. A pause. What is the song? It is not really a song. Marin used to hum it in the workroom. I do not think it has words. It is just something she does when her hands are busy, and I suppose I picked it up. Another silence. Then, it is the first sound I hear when I come back. Seren looked up. He was still bent over his reports, his pen in hand, his face angled away from her. But she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way the admission had cost him something. From the episodes? She asked carefully. Everything else is noise. Shouting, crashing, the wolf tearing at the inside of my skull. And then there is your voice, humming, and the noise stops. Seren did not know what to say to that, so she went back to her stitching and hummed a little louder. The first time he smiled at her, truly smiled, it happened over something stupid. She had been reattaching a button to one of his formal jackets, and the needle had slipped and jabbed her thumb, and she had yelped and shaken her hand, and then stuck her thumb in her mouth on reflex, which was not dignified behavior for the king's betrothed. When she looked up, mortified, he was watching her from behind his desk, and the corner of his mouth had lifted into something that was undeniably, unmistakably a smile. It transformed his face. The hard angles softened. The shadows beneath his eyes became less prominent. He looked younger, warmer, like a man instead of a monument. Occupational hazard? Seren muttered, pulling her thumb from her mouth. You have been mending for how many years? He asked. Since I was 9. And you still stab yourself. The needle slipped. Clearly. You are mocking me, Seren said, narrowing her eyes. I would never, he replied, and the smile widened just enough to show his teeth. Something warm turned over beneath her ribs. She looked down at the jacket in her lap and sewed the button on with far more concentration than it required. That night, she lay awake listening to him through the open door. His breathing was rough, uneven, the sound of a body fighting against rest. When I was 12, Seren said into the dark, Maren caught me trying to mend a tapestry that was beyond saving. The whole center was rotted through. She told me to throw it away, and I spent 3 weeks secretly working on it after hours, replacing thread by thread, until I had rebuilt the entire middle section from scratch. Silence from the other room. But the breathing had steadied slightly. Maren found it, Seren continued. She held it up to the light and spent about 5 minutes examining it. Then she said, "It is beautiful work, Seren. But the rot will come back. You cannot fix what was broken at the root." She paused. I did not understand what she meant at the time. The tapestry lasted another 6 months before the new threads failed. She was right. More silence. Then, so quiet she almost missed it. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are lying awake in the dark, and I thought a boring story about thread might help." A sound came through the doorway. Soft, almost startled. It took her a moment to realize he had laughed. Just barely. A ghost of the sound, but real. His breathing deepened within minutes. Seren lay in the dark, warmth spreading through her, and pressed her thumb against the ring on her finger until the metal bit into her skin. She was falling. She knew it the way she knew a stitch was about to come loose. The same quiet certainty, the same understanding that the damage was already done before her hands could intervene. He began to ask her questions during their afternoons in his study. Real questions. What was it like growing up in the lower quarters? Did she miss the mending hall? What was the most difficult thing she had ever repaired? She told him about the soldier's field jacket she had mended 7 times for the same tier because the man kept going back to the front and the leather kept splitting in the same place. "Did it hold?" Kaylin asked. "The 7th repair?" "It held." He came home. "And the jacket?" "He brought it to me one last time, not to fix. Just to show me it was done splitting." Something passed across Kaylin's face that she could not read, something deep and private. And he looked away toward the window. "Some things can be mended then," he said quietly. "Most things," Seren replied. "If you catch them early enough." His hand moved across the desk, and for a moment she thought he would reach for her. His fingers stopped an inch from her wrist, hovered, then withdrew. Seren went back to her stitching and pretended the almost touch had not made her heart beat so hard she could feel it in her teeth. That evening, she went looking for Maren. She found the old mender in the lower workroom, sorting thread by lamplight, her swollen fingers moving with the stubborn precision of someone who refused to let her body tell her what she could not do. "I need to ask you something," Seren said, closing the door behind her. "And I need you to be honest." Maren looked at her over the rim of her spectacles. "I am always honest. That is why people avoid me. The ring Theron gave me for the betrothal. The sapphire. You recognized it." Maren's hands stilled on the thread. "I saw your face when you looked at it," Seren pressed. "You knew that ring." A long silence filled the workroom. Maren set down her thread and folded her hands, and the expression on her face was the one she wore when she was about to deliver news that would leave a mark. "That ring was commissioned 4 years ago," Maren said. "For the king's intended. A woman named Davina Ashgrove, daughter of the Western Alpha. Their betrothal was the most celebrated match in a generation." Seren felt the floor tilt beneath her. "What happened?" "She left," Maren said simply. 3 weeks before the wedding. Vanished in the night. No letter, no explanation, no warning. One morning she was here, and the next morning she was not. The sapphire caught the lamplight, and suddenly the ring felt like a stone pulled from someone else's grave. "He never spoke of her again," Maren continued. "Her portrait was moved to the closed gallery. Her name was removed from the household records. Theron made sure of that. But the ring was kept." "Why?" Seren whispered. Maren looked at her with an expression that was equal parts pity and warning. "Because kings do not discard things they are not finished with, child." Seren walked back to her chambers in a daze. She climbed into her enormous borrowed bed in her enormous borrowed room, wearing a borrowed nightgown, with a borrowed ring on her finger that had been meant for another woman's hand. She stared at the ceiling and felt the warmth she had been building with Kaelin over the past 3 weeks curdle into something cold and uncertain. She was a replacement, a stand-in, the convenient solution to a problem that required a woman nearby, any woman. And the ring was not hers, had never been hers. It carried the ghost of someone beautiful and loved and chosen, someone who had left of her own free will. Through the open door, she heard Kaelin's breathing grow rough, heard the sheets shift as he turned. She should go to him, should hum, should tell a quiet, meaningless story about Thread until his breathing steadied and the wolf in his skull went quiet. Instead, she pulled the pillow over her face and tried to smother the ache spreading through her. In the morning, a messenger arrived at the palace gates, muddied and breathless, carrying a sealed letter bearing the crest of the Western Alpha. Seren watched from the window of the upper corridor as Theron took the letter, read it, and went completely still. He looked up, and his gaze swept the palace facade until it found her standing in the window above. The expression on his face made her stomach drop through the floor. She did not find out what the letter said. Not that day. But that evening, Kaelin did not come to supper. His study door was locked. And when Seren pressed her ear to the adjoining door of their chambers, she heard something she had never heard before. The king was pacing, back and forth, the rhythm frantic and uneven. And beneath the footsteps, so faint she almost missed it, the sound of something breaking. Not furniture, not stone. Something quieter than that. Something worse. Davina Ashgrove arrived on a Tuesday, in the rain, with a single trunk and no entourage. Seren watched from the upper corridor window as a carriage pulled through the palace gates, mud-spattered and unremarkable. She had expected something grander, a procession perhaps, banners, the kind of arrival that announced itself. Instead, a woman stepped out into the downpour, pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, and walked toward the palace doors with the quiet confidence of someone who already knew the way. She was more beautiful than her portrait. The painting had captured the auburn hair and the green eyes, but it had missed the way she moved, unhurried and certain, as though the world would wait for her because it always had. It had missed the way she tilted her chin up against the rain instead of ducking from it. It had missed the warmth in her face when she looked up at the palace and smiled like she was coming home. Seren's fingers closed around the sapphire on her left hand. Her stomach turned to ice. Theron intercepted Davina at the entrance. Seren could not hear their exchange, but she watched the beta's rigid posture, the careful way he spoke, and Davina's face shifting from warmth to something more guarded. She nodded once. Theron led her inside and out of Seren's line of sight. The palace changed within hours. A current ran through the staff, whispers passed behind cupped hands, glances exchanged across corridors. The king's former intended had returned. The woman who had vanished 3 weeks before their wedding, who had broken the heart of the most powerful alpha in the realm and walked away without a word. Seren heard 3 different versions of the story before midday. In one, Davina had been kidnapped. In another, she had fled an arranged match she never wanted. In the third, she had left because she loved him too much and feared the throne would destroy them both. Each version hurt in a different way. She did not see Kaelin until the evening meal. He arrived late, which he never did, and took his seat beside her without meeting her eyes. The hall was full. Every noble in the palace had found a reason to attend supper, their gazes sliding between Seren at the king's right hand and the empty chair 3 seats down that had been set with fresh silver. Davina entered through the side door and the room inhaled. She wore deep green, simple and elegant, and her hair was pinned back in a way that showed the long line of her throat. She moved to her assigned seat with her eyes forward, not looking at Kaelin, not looking at anyone. But the entire room was looking at her. Seren watched Kaelin's face. She watched it the way she examined damaged fabric, searching for the tear, the weak point, the place where the threads had given way. He did not look at Davina. His gaze stayed on his plate, on his cup, on the far wall. His hands were still. He was controlled, composed, and utterly, completely rigid in a way that told Seren everything his face would not. He was aware of Davina the way a compass was aware of north. After the meal, Seren walked back to her chambers alone. Kaelin had stayed behind to speak with his advisors, and she had slipped away without announcing her departure because nobody had noticed her leave. She sat on her bed and pulled the ring off her finger, held it in her palm. The sapphire caught the candlelight and threw tiny fragments of blue across the walls. She put it back on. That night, through the adjoining door, she heard him pacing again. She lay in the dark and listened, and for the first time since the arrangement began, she did not speak, did not hum, did not offer a story to quiet the noise in his head. He did not come to her door. She did not go to his. In the morning, his eyes were shadowed and his hands shook slightly when he reached for his cup at breakfast. An episode was building. Seren could feel it in the charged, brittle quality of the air around him, the way his wolf pressed against the surface. She reached for his hand, the gesture that had become instinct over the weeks, and he flinched. He caught himself immediately, covered the flinch with a reach for the bread, but she had felt it. The rejection traveled through her like a crack through glass. 3 seats away, Davina watched them both with an expression Seren could not read. The days that followed were the worst of Seren's life. Davina was kind. That was the cruelest part. She was not cold, not scheming, not the villain Seren desperately wanted her to be. When they crossed paths in the corridor, Davina smiled and asked genuine questions about the mending work, about Seren's background, about the betrothal. Her interest seemed real. Her warmth seemed real. Everything about her seemed real in a way that made Seren feel like a forgery. Kaelin withdrew. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, like a tide pulling back from shore. He still sat beside Seren at meals. He still allowed her presence during the day. But the small moments stopped. No more questions about her work. No more almost touches across the desk. No more quiet laughter over her stories. He was polite, distant, present in body and absent in every way that mattered. Seren tried harder. She arrived earlier to his study. She mended faster, neater, producing her finest work as though quality stitching could close the gap between them. She told better stories at night, funnier ones, reaching further into her memory for anything that might draw him back. He listened. He nodded. He said goodnight. And through the adjoining door she heard his breathing remain rough and uneven until dawn. The episodes shifted. They still came, but the recovery was slower now. Where once she could bring him back in under a minute, it now took 2, then 3, then 5. His eyes fought the return, gold clinging to the edges of gray like it did not want to leave. On the worst night, his hand found her wrist when the gold finally faded, and he held on so tightly it almost hurt. But in the morning, he let go and did not mention it. She started waking before dawn and standing at the mirror in the dim light, examining herself, measuring, comparing. She could not stop. Davina was taller. Davina was graceful. Davina had a lineage, a family name, a place in the world that she had been born into. Seren was a mender from the lower quarters who owned a single carved wooden bird. She stopped humming. She did not notice she had stopped until Marin pointed it out during a visit to the lower workroom. The old mender watched Seren work in silence for nearly an hour before speaking. "Where did your song go?" Marin asked. Seren looked up, confused. "What? You always hum? Since you were a child, you hummed while you worked. You have not made a sound in 20 minutes. Seren opened her mouth to deny it, then realized Marin was right. The humming had stopped days ago, quietly, without her permission, like a bird that had simply stopped singing because it no longer believed anyone was listening. "I am fine," Seren said. "You are disappearing," Marin replied. The word landed like a slap. Seren looked down at her hands, at the thread between her fingers, at the ring that glinted even in the low light of the workroom. You are making yourself smaller, Maren continued, her voice stripped of gentleness. You are shrinking to fit into the space they have left for you, and soon there will be nothing left to shrink. It is not like that. Then tell me what it is like. Saren could not answer, because Maren was right, and she knew it, and the knowing settled over her like a weight she could not put down. That afternoon, she saw them together. She had come to deliver a mended cloak to Theron's office, and the door to the adjacent sitting room was ajar. Through the gap, she could see Kaelin standing by the window, and Davina seated in the chair across from him. They were speaking in low voices. Saren could not make out the words, but she could read the language of their bodies. Davina leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap, her face open and earnest. Kaelin stood with his arms crossed, his posture defensive, but his face was turned toward her with an intensity he had not shown anyone in weeks. Then Davina said something, and Kaelin's arms dropped to his sides. His expression cracked, just for a moment, and beneath the mask of the king, Saren saw the man. Wounded, wanting, lost. Davina reached for his hand. He did not pull away. Saren stepped back from the door on silent feet and walked blindly down the corridor until she found an empty stairwell. She sat on the cold stone steps, pressed her forehead against her knees, and tried to breathe through the fist that had closed around her lungs. She was not angry. That was what frightened her most. She was not angry at Davina for returning, or at Kaelin for still loving her, or at Theron for engineering this whole arrangement without warning her what she was walking into. She was angry at herself, for believing the ring meant something, for imagining that the small moments, the almost touches, the laughter, the breathing that steadied when she spoke, were the beginning of something real. She had been a remedy, a treatment, a mender brought in to fix a broken king until the original piece could be found and restored. And now the original piece was here, and Saren was what she had always been. The girl from the lower quarters who was good with her hands and easy to replace. That evening, she knocked on Theron's office door. I need to know something, Saren said, not sitting down. Did the council consider dissolving the betrothal when Davina returned? Theron's face betrayed nothing. The matter has been discussed. And? No decision has been made. But it has been discussed, Saren repeated, replacing me with her. Theron met her eyes. The betrothal was a practical arrangement, Saren. If another practical arrangement presents itself, the council has a duty to consider it. The honesty should have been a kindness. Instead, it carved through her like a blade drawn slowly across skin. Thank you for your candor, Saren said, and her voice did not crack, which she considered her finest achievement of the day. She returned to her chambers, closed the door, and stood in the middle of the room that had never been hers. The fine linens, the fresh flowers, the fire someone else had lit. All borrowed, all temporary, all waiting to be reclaimed by the woman they were originally meant for. Through the adjoining door, she heard Kaelin's footsteps enter his chambers, heard him pause, heard him take a breath as though he was about to speak. The silence stretched. Good night, Saren, he said finally, his voice rough and barely audible through the wood. She pressed her palm flat against the door and closed her eyes. Good night, Your Majesty, she whispered back. She had not called him that in weeks. The distance in it was deliberate, a stitch pulled free, the beginning of an unraveling she could already feel taking hold. She did not sleep. Saren found Maren at dawn, sitting in the workroom with a cup of tea that had long gone cold. I need your help, Saren said from the doorway. Maren looked up. Whatever she saw in Saren's face made her set the cup down slowly. Sit. Saren sat across from her and placed her hands flat on the table. The ring caught the early light. She stared at it. You told me once that you cannot fix what was broken at the root, Saren said. The tapestry with the rotted center. Do you remember? I remember. I did not understand what you meant then. I think I do now. Maren waited, her sharp eyes steady. I have been trying to mend something that was not mine to mend, Saren continued, her voice even. I have been stitching myself into a space that was cut for someone else, and every day I stay, I lose a little more of the thread that makes me who I am. Marin reached across the table and covered Seren's hands with her own. Her swollen fingers were warm and rough and familiar. What do you want to do? Marin asked. Seren looked at the ring one more time. Then she looked at Marin. I want to go home. Child, Marin said gently. You do not have a home. You never did. Then I want to build one. The old mender's eyes glistened. She squeezed Serene's hands once, hard, and nodded. Seren spent the morning packing. It did not take long. The fine dresses, the borrowed jewelry, the silk nightgowns. She left them all. She folded her original dress, the one she had arrived in, placed her mending kit beside it, and set the carved wooden bird on top. Her whole life fit into the same basket she had carried up from the lower quarters weeks ago. She found Kalen in his study that afternoon. He was alone, which was rare now. Maps were spread across his desk, weighed down with stones, and his pen was in his hand. But he was not writing. He was staring at the wall with the unfocused expression of a man whose mind was somewhere else entirely. He looked up when she entered, and his face opened for a moment. A flicker of the man she had come to know in those quiet afternoons, the one who asked about her stories and almost smiled and listened to her hum. Seren, he said, and the way he said her name made her throat tighten. She crossed the room and stopped on the opposite side of the desk. Close enough to see the shadows under his eyes, the tension carved into the lines of his mouth. Close enough to reach for him if she wanted to. She did not reach for him. I came to return this, Seren said, and she pulled the ring from her finger. She set it on the desk between them. The sapphire clicked against the wood and lay there, small and bright and final. Kalen stared at the ring, then at her. His expression did not change, but his hands went very still. I know what this ring is, Seren said. I know who it was made for. And I know that when the council discussed dissolving our betrothal, you did not object. His knuckles went white against the edge of the desk. Seren, that is not what happened. You did not object, she repeated quietly. And I do not blame you for it. She is remarkable, Kalen. She is everything a queen should be. And she came back for you, which means she loves you, and you deserve to be loved by someone who chose you first. You chose me, he said, and his voice cracked on the last word. No, Seren replied, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. I chose to help you. I chose to stay when you needed someone to stay. I chose to hum in the dark and hold your face when your eyes went gold and sleep behind a borrowed door because your wolf needed mine nearby. But you did not choose me, Kalen. You chose a solution, and now you have a better one. He stood. The chair scraped back against the stone, and he moved around the desk toward her, and she could see it happening. The reach, the instinct to close the gap, to pull her in, to fix this the way he fixed everything, with force and proximity and the sheer weight of his presence. She held up her hand, and he stopped. Do not, she whispered. If you touch me right now, I will stay. And if I stay, I will spend the rest of my life wondering if you kept me because you wanted me or because I was convenient. I cannot live like that. I will not. His face broke open. The mask, the wall, the iron composure he wore like armor, all of it crumbled, and what was left was raw and desperate and aching. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I know, Seren replied, and she smiled. It was not a bitter smile, not a broken one. It was the saddest, warmest, most honest expression she had ever worn, and it cost her more than anything she had ever given. You are a good man, she told him. You deserve to sleep peacefully. You deserve to be whole, but I deserve to be someone's first choice, not their compromise, not their remedy. She stepped forward, rose on her toes, and pressed a kiss to his cheek. She felt his breath catch, felt his hand twitch at his side, felt the ghost of everything they might have been if the timing had been different, if the ring had been hers, if she had been the woman in the portrait. She stepped back, picked up her basket from beside the door where she had left it. "Goodbye, Your Majesty," she said. She did not look back as she walked out, though every step away from him felt like pulling thread from a wound. She kept her spine straight. She kept her chin up. She walked through the corridors she had come to know, past the guards who nodded at her, past the gallery where Davina's portrait hung, past the mending hall where her life had made sense, and out through the palace gates into the cold morning air. Maren was waiting for her in the courtyard with a heavy cloak and a small purse of coin. "The village of Thornhaven is 3 days east," Maren said, wrapping the cloak around Seren's shoulders. "A textile merchant there owes me a favor. She will give you work." Seren pulled the cloak tight and looked back at the palace one last time. Somewhere behind those walls, a king was holding a ring meant for another woman, and the space where Seren had been was already closing over like water. She turned east and started walking. Thornhaven was small, a market town built along a river, with stone bridges and thatched roofs, and the kind of quiet that settled into your bones after the first week and refused to leave. The textile merchant Maren had mentioned was a broad-shouldered woman named Odette, who asked no questions, handed Seren a needle, and pointed her toward a pile of work that needed doing. Seren mended. She mended curtains and coats and saddlebags. She repaired a merchant's traveling cloak that had been slashed by a branch on the forest road. She restitched a child's stuffed rabbit that had lost an ear, and the little girl who came to collect it hugged Serene's legs so tightly she had to pry herself free. She rented a room above the shop, small and drafty and entirely hers. She bought her own candle. She lit her own fire. She ate bread that she chose and paid for with coin she earned. And every night she slept in a bed that belonged to nobody else. The first week was the hardest. The absence of him was physical, a hollowness behind her ribs that pulsed with every heartbeat, a phantom warmth along her left side where his presence used to be. She woke in the dark, reaching for a door that was not there, listening for breathing she could not hear. She did not go back. The second week, the ache dulled. Not gone, but quieter, like a bruise fading from purple to yellow. She threw herself into work, into the rhythm of thread and needle that had always been her anchor. Odette noticed her skill and gave her the finer commissions, embroidery repairs and lacework that required precision most hands could not manage. "You are good," Odette said one afternoon, examining a collar Seren had rebuilt from almost nothing. "I have been doing this a long time," Seren replied. "Not just good with the needle," Odette clarified, "good at seeing what something was before it broke." The words stayed with her. On the 17th day, she hummed. It happened without warning. She was bent over a torn riding glove, her fingers moving on instinct, and the sound rose from her chest before she could stop it. Maren's tuneless melody, the one that had no words, the one she had carried since childhood. She stopped, startled by her own voice in the quiet room. Then she smiled, and kept humming. The news reached Thornhaven in fragments. A traveling merchant mentioned that the Alpha King had withdrawn from public life. A letter carrier spoke of cancelled councils and closed doors. Odette, who had contacts in the capital, told Seren one evening that the king's condition had deteriorated sharply in recent weeks. "They say he is unwell," Odette said carefully, watching Seren's face. "The fractures are worse. His beta has taken over most of the governance." Seren's hands stilled on the fabric in her lap. The ache behind her ribs flared, bright and sharp, and for one terrible moment she felt the pull. The instinct to go back, to fix, to mend what was broken because that was what she did, what she had always done, what she was for. She breathed through it, set the fabric down, picked it up again. "I hope he finds what he needs," Seren said quietly. Odette studied her for a long moment, then nodded and said nothing more. He came on the 29th day. Seren was closing the shop shutters when she saw him standing across the street. No guards, no entourage, no crown, no formal coat. Nothing that marked him as anything other than a tall man in a traveling cloak who looked like he had not slept in a month. Kaelin. Her heart seized. He looked diminished in a way that hurt to see. The broad shoulders were still there, the hard jaw, the gray eyes, but the steadiness was gone. He looked hollowed out, uncertain, standing in a muddy street in a town he had no reason to know existed, watching her with an expression that held no authority and no demand, just need. Serene set the shutters and crossed the street. They stood a foot apart, and the silence between them was heavy with everything that had been said and everything that had not. "You should not be here," Seren said. "I know." His voice was rougher than she remembered, frayed at the edges. "I came because I owed you something." "You do not owe me anything. I owe you the truth." He swallowed hard, and she watched his throat work, watched the effort it took him to force the words out. "You were right. About everything. I did not choose you. I used you. I told myself it was practical, that the arrangement was necessary, that I was protecting the realm, but I was protecting myself. From feeling anything real, from risking what I had already lost once." Seren listened. The wind from the river pressed against her back, cold and steady. When Davina came back, I thought the answer was simple. She was what I had wanted before. She was familiar. She was safe. He paused. "But she is not you." The words settled over her, warm and aching and impossible to hold. "I am not asking you to come back," Kaelin said. "I would not insult you by asking that. But I needed you to know that what we had was not nothing. It was not convenience. It was not a remedy. I just realized it too late." Seren looked at him for a long time, at the shadows under his eyes, at the hands that hung at his sides, empty and open, at the man who had held a kingdom together with iron will and could not hold himself together without her humming in the dark. "You did not come here for me," she said gently. "You came here because you still have not learned to be whole on your own, and I cannot teach you that, Kaelin. No one can. You have to learn it the way I did, by choosing yourself, even when it hurts." His face crumbled. Just for a second, just a fracture in the mask, and she saw the grief underneath. Not for her. For the version of himself that had not been brave enough to love her when it mattered. "Go home," Seren whispered. "Fix what is broken at the root. Not with me, not with Davina. With yourself." She reached out and took his hand. Squeezed once. Let go. Then she turned, crossed the street, and walked back into her shop. She closed the door. She leaned against it and pressed her hands to her face, and breathed until the shaking stopped. When she looked out the window, the street was empty. Months passed. The seasons turned. The river beside Thornhaven froze, thawed, and froze again. Seren opened her own shop in the spring, a narrow storefront with a hand-painted sign that read, "Seren's," and nothing more, because she had decided that her name was enough. Odette helped her stock the shelves. Maren sent a letter with a pressed flower inside and a single line of advice. "Charge more than you think you are worth." She did. The shop grew slowly, the way good things do. Word spread about the mender in Thornhaven who could bring back a garment from ruin, who could see what something had been before it was damaged and coax it back to life. Customers came from neighboring villages, then from towns further east, then from places Seren had never heard of. She hired an apprentice, a quiet girl with steady hands and a tendency to hum while she worked. Seren did not correct this. She thought of Kaelin sometimes. Not with longing, not anymore. With something softer. A tenderness for the version of herself who had loved him, who had believed that being needed was the same as being wanted. That girl had done her best. She deserved grace for that. News drifted in from the capital. The king had entered treatment with a healer from the Northern Territories, a specialist in wolf mind fractures. The episodes had slowed. The court had stabilized. Davina Ashgrove had returned to the western provinces, and the king remained unmarried. Seren read the news, folded the letter, and went back to her stitching. On a warm evening in late summer, she sat in the doorway of her shop with a cup of tea, watching the light turn gold across the river. The apprentice had gone home. The shutters were open. A breeze carried the smell of cut grass and warm stone. Seren picked up the glove she had been working on and threaded her needle. She hummed. The melody rose into the evening air, tuneless and familiar. The same one Maren had given her all those years ago in the lower workroom. She was not waiting for anyone. She was not mending anyone else's story. She was writing her own.